I watched my daughter walk down the aisle in a dress I didn't pay for, surrounded by people who pitied my widow's struggle. None of them knowing I had $33 million sitting quietly in my account, and a secret I swore I'd never reveal. The morning my husband died, the world felt like it had cracked open beneath my feet. I remember standing in the hospital corridor, staring at the floor tiles as if they could somehow anchor me to reality. The doctor's words were muffled, like I was hearing them underwater. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Andrews, he didn't make it." My husband, Richard, was gone, and the life we had built together, the plans we had for our retirement, the trips we were supposed to take, all dissolved into the thin hospital air. I thought I would never recover from the void he left behind. What I didn't know, what I couldn't even begin to imagine, was that his death would come with a secret so powerful it would change the way I saw everyone around me, including my own daughter. Richard had always been private about finances. We had a comfortable life, of course, a large house in the suburbs, vacations every summer, and a college fund for our daughter, Emily. But I had no idea just how wealthy he truly was. When we first married, Richard told me he wanted me to live without worrying about numbers on a screen or bank statements. "Let me handle all of that," he used to say with that warm smile that could melt away any worry. And I trusted him. We were partners in everything, and money was never an issue for us. We were never flashy, never the kind of people who boasted about what we had. Richard was a man who believed in quiet success, and I loved him for it. The weeks following his death were a blur of condolences, casseroles delivered by neighbors, and phone calls from distant relatives who suddenly remembered my number. Everyone seemed to want something, not necessarily money, but pieces of him. His brother wanted his watch, his mother wanted the leather armchair he loved, and even friends came by to ask for mementos. It was overwhelming. I could barely breathe without thinking of him, and here they were, circling like vultures, each trying to grab a piece of the man I had loved for decades. When the lawyer called to discuss the will, I went into the office expecting something simple. Our home, a few savings accounts, maybe some investments I vaguely knew about. But as I sat across from Mr. Fletcher, our family lawyer, he slid a thick folder across the table, his expression calm but almost amused. "Mrs. Andrews," he said, clearing his throat, "Richard was a man of great foresight. He left you something substantial." I remember blinking at him, not fully understanding what he meant. "Substantial?" I repeated. "Yes," he said, leaning forward. "Richard had a separate trust account. He wanted you to have full control of it. As of now, that account holds $33 million. The number hit me like a brick to the chest. 33 million. I must have misheard him. I asked him to repeat it 3 times, and each time, the number stayed the same. I felt dizzy, nauseous even. My husband, the man who clipped grocery coupons just for fun, who drove the same car for 10 years without complaint, had left me a fortune. I sat there, speechless, while Mr. Fletcher explained that Richard had been quietly building his wealth for years, investments, company shares, and land deals that had all paid off. He had done it all without ever making me feel like our life was about money. He had wanted me to be happy, not burdened by the weight of millions. When I walked out of that office, I felt like I was carrying a secret bigger than myself. $33 million. What would people say if they knew? What would my family do? I knew exactly how they'd react, with greed, with envy, with outstretched hands asking for their share. I had already seen hints of it. My in-laws, barely a week after Richard's funeral, had started giving me unsolicited advice about downsizing and managing on a single income. They believed I was left with scraps. I let them believe it. I nodded politely when they said, "If you need anything, don't be afraid to ask." But deep inside, I wanted to scream, "You have no idea who you're talking to. You have no idea what he left me." Emily, my daughter, was different. She never asked about money. She was in her mid-20s, engaged to a kind young man named Matthew, and busy planning her wedding. She never asked me for financial help, though I could see the stress in her eyes when she talked about wedding costs. She would call me late at night sighing, "Mom, the venue is so expensive. We might just do something small. Maybe a backyard wedding." I wanted to tell her I could give her the wedding of her dreams, that I could make every worry vanish with a single wire transfer. But I didn't. Why? Because I was afraid. Afraid of what money does to people. I had seen it firsthand. Years ago, when Richard received a large bonus, some of our friends treated us differently. Invitations came not because they wanted to spend time with us, but because they wanted favors. Family members started calling more, not out of love, but out of curiosity about what they could get. I didn't want that to happen to Emily. I didn't want her to marry Matthew thinking that money would be a safety net they didn't have to work for. I wanted her to build her life, her marriage, on something real: love, hard work, and resilience. So, I kept the $33 million a secret. The months leading up to Emily's wedding were difficult for me. She worked long hours and saved every penny she could, cutting corners wherever possible. She chose a simple dress, borrowed decorations from friends, and opted for a small, intimate ceremony. I watched her do all this while biting my tongue. I wanted to tell her, "Let me take care of it. Let me give you everything you deserve." But I didn't. Instead, I offered emotional support, told her she looked beautiful no matter what, and helped her bake cupcakes when the caterer fell through. The night before the wedding, Emily sat next to me on the couch, her head resting on my shoulder. "Mom," she whispered, "I know we don't have much, but I've never felt richer than I do right now." I felt tears burn my eyes. She didn't know how true her words were, not in the way she meant, but in the way that truly mattered. She was rich in love, in character, in gratitude. And I realized that by not handing her everything on a silver platter, I had allowed her to become the kind of woman who could weather any storm. On the day of the wedding, I sat in the front row, watching her walk down the aisle. She looked radiant, her smile brighter than any diamond. People glanced at me, some of them whispering about how sad it was that I couldn't contribute more to the wedding. I ignored them. If they only knew. If they only knew that I could have bought the entire venue 10 times over. But their assumptions didn't matter. All that mattered was that my daughter was marrying for love, not for money. After the ceremony, I stood alone for a moment, watching her dance with Matthew. I thought about Richard, how proud he would have been, how he would have spun her around the dance floor and whispered something sweet to her. I missed him so much it physically hurt. But I also knew, deep down, that the choice I had made, to stay quiet about the inheritance, was exactly what he would have wanted. He had always told me, "Money is a tool, not a gift. The real gift is who you become when you have nothing but your heart to rely on." As the reception carried on, I slipped outside for some air. I looked up at the night sky, the stars scattered like tiny diamonds, and I whispered, "Richard, I hope I'm doing this right." Because in that moment, I wasn't entirely sure. Maybe I was wrong to keep it a secret. Maybe I was depriving Emily of something she deserved. But deep inside, I believed that this secret wasn't about withholding love, it was about protecting it. Over the next weeks, I would wrestle with that decision more than ever. Because money has a way of haunting you, even when it's hidden. In the weeks after Emily's wedding, life slowed down, but the weight of my secret grew heavier. I found myself walking through the house late at night, touching Richard's old shirts still hanging in the closet, rereading the letter he left in the trust documents, the one where he said, "Use this wisely, love, but never let it use you." I had memorized those words. I whispered them to myself like a prayer every time I felt tempted to log into that account and change everything. I knew I could buy Emily and Matthew a house, pay off their student loans, give them the kind of financial security that would take most couples decades to build. But each time I reached for the idea, I pulled back. Because there was something deeper going on, something no one around me could see. You see, money wasn't just money after Richard died. It became a test of character, a mirror that showed me who people really were when they thought I had nothing to give. I started watching everyone more closely, my neighbors, my friends, even distant relatives. The shift was subtle, but noticeable. Invitations to dinner stopped arriving. I was no longer seen as a woman with potential influence or generous gifts to offer. I became invisible in rooms where wealth opened doors. I smiled through it all. Part of me was devastated by how transactional people could be, but another part of me, the part that had lived beside Richard's quiet wisdom for 30 years, was oddly grateful for the clarity. Because once you know who's real, you can finally breathe. Emily and Matthew's first year of marriage was both beautiful and brutal. I watched them struggle through small arguments about rent and rising grocery prices. I saw Emily, who once dreamed of opening her own floral business, take on extra shifts at a retail job just to make ends meet. I sat with her some nights when she cried quietly into a mug of tea, frustrated at the tightness of life. It broke my heart, but I also saw something extraordinary. She never blamed anyone. She never complained about what she didn't have. Instead, she got up every morning, kissed her husband, and tried again. There was a resilience in her that reminded me of my younger self, back when Richard and I shared a tiny apartment and counted pennies to buy a second-hand crib for her. That version of me would never have believed where life would take us, to private jets and investments, to secret accounts and impossible numbers. But all of that had come much later. What had built our life wasn't wealth, it was endurance, teamwork, faith in each other when everything felt uncertain. And that's what I wanted for Emily, not a shortcut, but a solid foundation. Still, I'd be lying if I said I didn't question myself. There were days when I paced the hallway, wondering if my silence was selfish. I thought of all the things Emily could have had, the dream honeymoon she skipped, the wedding dress she put back on the rack because it was just out of budget, the business she could have started with a single push. One afternoon, after she left my house with a bag of groceries I'd pretended were leftovers, I broke down in the kitchen, sobbing into my hands. The guilt was sharp, raw, and real. But then I found an old photo in the drawer, Emily as a little girl, muddy from the garden, holding a tiny bouquet of wildflowers with a triumphant grin. She had always found beauty in the dirt, joy in the simplest things. That photo anchored me again. She was still that girl. And I had to believe she would find her way, even without knowing the fortune that lay just a signature away. Then came the night that changed everything. Emily showed up at my door unexpectedly, her eyes puffy, her hands shaking. Matthew had lost his job, laid off without warning, and their landlord had given them an eviction notice. She tried to stay calm, tried to sound brave, but I could see the panic underneath her words. She asked softly if they could stay with me for a while. Just until we get back on our feet. My heart shattered. I hugged her and said yes, of course yes, for as long as they needed. That night, as I made up the guest room and folded spare blankets, I knew the moment was coming. The moment where my silence would either turn into cruelty or into revelation. I couldn't let her believe she had no options. Not anymore. I stayed up all night, sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the checkbook I rarely used. The numbers blurred as I ran through every scenario in my head. How would she react? Would she be angry? Feel betrayed? Would it damage our bond, or strengthen it? I didn't know. But I knew that hiding it now served no purpose. The lesson had already been learned. She had proven herself 100 times over. She had loved through struggle, lived with integrity, and never once leaned on entitlement. If anyone deserved to know the truth, it was her. So, the next morning, before the sun rose, I wrote her a letter. Not a long one. Just the truth. I told her about the inheritance, about Richard's secret fortune, and why I had kept it hidden. I told her I was proud of the woman she had become, and that now, finally, it was time for her to receive not just money, but the trust and responsibility that came with it. When she woke up, I handed her the envelope in silence. She looked confused, then curious, and finally stunned. She read the letter twice, then again. Her hands trembled as she opened the check I had enclosed, not for the full inheritance, but for a meaningful start, $2 million. Enough to change her life, but not to overwhelm it. She looked at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Is this real?" she whispered. I nodded. Every word. She didn't shout. She didn't ask why I had kept it from her. Instead, she walked around the table and hugged me, tightly, fiercely, and began to cry. "Thank you," she said through her tears, "for believing I could be someone even without it." In that moment, every doubt, every sleepless night, every bite of guilt disappeared. She understood. She truly understood. The next few months brought changes, of course. Emily and Matthew bought a modest home, nothing extravagant. She opened her floral shop, just a small one, painted in pastel colors with hand-picked bouquets in the window. She didn't flaunt the money. In fact, no one else knew. She chose to keep the secret, just like I had. Maybe she understood the value of quiet power, of silent security. We never told the rest of the family. Let them continue believing in the narrative they had created, the widow and her struggling daughter, scraping by on grit and grace. The truth didn't need to be theirs. It was ours. And so, the $33 million remained largely untouched, growing silently in the background. Not a prize. Not a reward. But a shield. A sanctuary. A lesson in love, patience, and trust. Sometimes, when I walk past the mirror in the hallway and catch my reflection, I see the woman I became after Richard died, wiser, quieter, stronger. And I think of him, of the way he planned all of this without telling me, trusting that I'd know what to do when the time came. I think I did. I hope I did. Because this story isn't about money. It's about silence. About watching your child suffer, knowing you could end it all with a few words, and choosing not to. Not out of cruelty, but out of love. Because real love doesn't always rescue. Sometimes it waits. It watches. And when the moment is right, it reveals everything, not as a gift, but as a reflection of who we've become. The days following my revelation passed in a strange haze, not chaotic, not dramatic, but quietly intense. After all the waiting, all the nights I spent guarding a truth I feared might shatter everything, the moment had come and gone without the explosion I imagined. Emily knew. She finally knew. The weight of $33 million, and the silence I had carried with it, had landed in her hands like a feather rather than a bomb. But what came next was something I hadn't quite prepared for, the rebuilding. Not of trust, that, miraculously, was still intact, but of the roles we now played in each other's lives. Because secrets change people. Even the ones kept with love. Emily was quiet in the days that followed. Not distant, but thoughtful. She didn't bombard me with questions, though I knew she had many. Instead, she began observing me, in the same way I had once observed her, as if trying to reconcile the mother she thought she knew with the woman who had kept a secret so massive it could have rewritten her entire past. I found her sometimes looking at old photo albums, or sitting at Richard's desk, tracing her fingers along the grain of the wood. Once, I saw her holding the framed wedding photo of me and Richard, staring into it as though searching for hidden clues. She never asked why he never told her. I think she knew the answer already, that this wasn't just about money. This was about trust, protection, and the complicated legacy of love. One evening, we sat on the porch in silence, sipping tea as the sky burned orange and pink with the summer sunset. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "You didn't tell me because you wanted to see who I would become without it." I turned to look at her, but she kept her eyes on the horizon. And I think I understand now. But it still hurts a little, Mom. Not because I wanted the money, but because I needed you. I needed help. And you let me believe you couldn't give it. Her voice didn't tremble. It was firm, steady, and heartbreakingly honest. I set my cup down and reached for her hand. "I know, sweetheart. And I can't change that. But I need you to understand something. I wasn't trying to punish you. I wasn't trying to watch you struggle just to prove a point. I was trying to give you something your father and I built our whole life on: strength. Independence. That feeling of rising up, not because someone carried you, but because you learned to climb." She nodded slowly, her eyes welling with tears. You did climb, Emily. And now you're standing. And I have never been more proud. It wasn't a movie moment. There was no dramatic music, no sweeping hug with emotional crescendo. Just two women, sitting in the fading light, rebuilding a bridge made not of apologies but of mutual understanding. And that, I realized, was far more powerful. As weeks turned into months, I watched Emily begin to bloom in ways I hadn't seen before. The floral shop she opened became more than just a business, it was an extension of her soul. Every bouquet she arranged, every ribbon she tied, every event she decorated carried her signature blend of creativity and compassion. Word began to spread. Brides began requesting her by name. She hired a small team, taught them her methods, and quietly, steadily, she built something remarkable. Not because of the money, but because she had built the discipline before it ever arrived. Matthew, too, changed in subtle but significant ways. When Emily told him about the inheritance, he was stunned. But he didn't turn greedy. In fact, he sat her down and said, "Let's pretend this doesn't exist until we've earned the life we want. Not bought it." That was the moment I knew Emily had chosen well. The kind of man who wouldn't let money define their marriage. And in doing so, they became partners not just in life, but in legacy. I began to let go of my fear. For so long, I had believed that revealing the money would destroy the integrity of those around me. That it would invite entitlement, jealousy, even manipulation. But what I hadn't counted on was how much Emily had grown. She wasn't the girl crying over wedding budgets anymore. She was a woman building her empire not from my wealth, but from her will. And that changed something inside me. For the first time since Richard's death, I stopped guarding the money like a dragon in a cave. I started seeing it for what it truly was, not a weapon, not a curse, but a resource. One that, if used wisely, could empower rather than enable. I began involving Emily in decisions. Investments, charitable donations, even the management of Richard's remaining assets. We sat together in the study, poring over documents, discussing risks and ethics and long-term planning. I watched her eyes light up with ideas. She suggested starting a foundation, one that would help young women start small businesses, especially those without family support. Just like I didn't have, she said quietly. My heart caught in my throat. The idea was hers, but the vision felt shared. We were no longer just mother and daughter. We were partners in something bigger than both of us. We launched the Wild Bloom Foundation 6 months later. Named after the way she used to gather wildflowers from the backyard as a child, it became a symbol of resilience, of things that grow where they're not expected to. We funded workshops, grants, mentorships. And we kept it quiet. No press. No public announcement. Just a quiet storm of goodness rolling through the lives of women who had been told, again and again, that they couldn't. Emily looked at me one day, watching a video testimonial from a young single mother who used the grant to open a bakery, and said, This is what the money was meant for, isn't it?" And I nodded, smiling through tears. Yes. Exactly this. Of course, not everything was perfect. Family members eventually grew suspicious. Cousins who had long forgotten our birthdays suddenly began calling. My sister-in-law, once convinced I was struggling financially, showed up with veiled questions about inheritance issues and whether I needed help selling the house. The shift was subtle, but I felt it. That creeping sense of artificial warmth, the return of conditional kindness. But this time, I wasn't shaken. I had learned to navigate these waters. So had Emily. We responded with kindness, but never with access. We smiled, but we guarded our doors. The lesson Richard had left behind remained sacred. You don't owe wealth to those who only see you through its lens. One quiet evening, almost a year after Emily learned the truth, we visited the cemetery. It wasn't a special occasion, just a shared feeling that we wanted to see him. We brought flowers, of course. White lilies, his favorite. We sat beside his grave in silence, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no heaviness. No grief weighing down my chest. Just gratitude. I placed my hand on the cold stone and whispered, "She's everything we hoped she'd be, Rich." Emily knelt beside me and added, "And she's the reason I became her." That night, as we drove home, Emily turned to me and asked something that took me by surprise. "Do you ever regret not telling me sooner?" I thought for a long moment, then answered honestly, "Sometimes. In the quiet moments. When I heard you crying and wanted to fix everything. But now, looking at who you are, I think, no. I think it happened the way it was meant to." She smiled softly. "Me too." And that was the smoothest closure I could have hoped for. Not a grand finale, but a quiet agreement that sometimes, the hardest decisions lead us exactly where we're meant to be. The money didn't divide us. It didn't corrupt us. It revealed us. It gave us the chance to be better than we thought we were. To use what we had, not just to survive, but to serve. So, I no longer call it a secret. I call it a seed. One planted in silence, watered with love, and now blooming in ways Richard and I never could have predicted. Emily is thriving. I am at peace. And together, we are rewriting what inheritance truly means, not just wealth, but wisdom. Not just privilege, but purpose. Because in the end, this isn't just the story of what I kept hidden. It's the story of what we found on the other side of silence.